Good afternoon. My name is Fatima Lopez, and this is my presentation on the Victorian crisis of faith. An important kickstarter of the plot of the book Silas Marner by George Eliot is faith and the impact on human when it is lost. While it is not the main point, it's impossible to ignore the importance of this in the rest of the novel. It could even be said that this affection was a true reflection of the Victorian society at that time. Today, I will talk about an important historical event that is very intricately related to this novel. As I said before, the Victorian crisis of faith. And of course, how does that relate to the book? First of all, the novel tells the story of a man who is expelled from his village under wrongful charges and finds himself being an outsider in a new community. This makes him borderline delirious and self-obsessed with his gold coins, product of his labor as a weaver. The story is told through several years in which he struggles with his identity in a society, also with love and greed, and most importantly, faith. Silence comes into the story as someone who is disappointed in life and injustice. Being an introverted man, he loses himself among his own thoughts, leading to his inevitable loneliness and loss of faith too. He represents the common man in 19th century England, who, because of the hypocrisy and alternatives to religion, he felt compelled to let go of it completely. He's just a representation of a lonely man, but his story is much more complex. During this period, the Victorian crisis of faith period, or the Victorian era in general, individuals became more aware of their surroundings. A big breakthrough for humanity was the publication of Darwin's The Origin of the Species. Along with rampant industrialization and major economic perspective in the life of people, they became more skeptical of whether everything they had been told was true. With Enlightenment rationalism, higher criticism of the Bible, especially the Genesis, and new theories of physical science, these were the chief causes for people to reject the faith of their childhoods and their upbringing. The most important representative of this quote-unquote battle in science's side is Charles Darwin, of course. Since the publication of his magnum opus, Darwin argued that the idea that an all-encompassing force or God that created the universe was not possible, presenting his theory of evolution as proof of such. On the other side of the argument was William Paley with natural theology, which repeated the argument that natural objects show evidence of design, therefore showing the existence of a God. This idea is conflicting, and this battle is as long as time itself. However, this period of human history can be said that science had both the crowd approval and the ideological head start. Most people were leaning more towards science than they were towards religion. Therefore, that brings us agnosticism. Because of the aforementioned fight, agnosticism became very popular among people in the 19th century. Agnosticism, defined by Huxley, is a state of being agnostic, or a person who has entertained the proposition that there is a God, but believes neither that is true nor that is false. The agnostic says that reason can never be used to prove the existing of a being that transcends reason, and whether or not they exist, they do not intervene in human affairs, making all of the speculation about their existence useless. The author, being an agnostic themselves, I refer to George Eliot, demonstrating their writing the moral dilemma surrounding life back then, the inevitability of life without the comfort of the higher power of the God, quickly became a jumping off point for depressive, if you could call it that, periods of history, also other philosophies, and much more speculation. Now, symbolism in Silas Marner. There are many symbols in the novel, but regarding this particular, I find the subplot of his adoption of a bee the most relevant. The child is seen as an object of faith since the moment she comes into the story. She's seen as a miracle in a failing marriage and then a divine sign for an obsessive and greedy man. She is that valuable coin that buys the faith they all lacked. Putting this into historical context, she could symbolize the transition from Christianity to agnosticism of the people, from being frowned upon for her very existence to being worshipped by everyone and thought of as a necessary change to a man's life. In this case, Silas, and in this other case, the people of the Victorian era. Women and the crisis of faith. Talking about the daughter, it is impossible not to talk about how the crisis of faith affected women. In religious societies, women held only one role, marriage and that of servitude. To quote Dr. Alison Barr, as the role of the wife expanded, the opportunities for women outside of marriage shrank. The family became not only the center of a woman's world, but her primary identity as a good Christian. The subjugation of women is indeed a historical constant, but that does not make it divinely ordained. By this, I do not mean that oppression for housewives ended with the crisis of faith. Rather, it paved the way for more outspoken women who were not longer bound by the rules of a church, rather by their own morality and intellect, like Charlotte Bronte here, Elizabeth Gaskell, and of course, our own George Eliot. Now, the conflict between spirituality and faith. Nowadays, it's much more common to not be a part of a religious group or rather to believe in vague ideals. During the time of the massive loss of faith, people started drifting towards spiritualism, the belief system that was based on communicating with spirits, the earth, and souls. This was started in the 1840s and quickly spread around the world. It rebelled against the traditional ideas of a religion and supposedly used scientific proof to prove the existence of a God. Also, it was much more liberal and it attracted many people and women because of this. It's also important to note that at the time, this was the only religion, if you could call it that saw women as equals, making the newfound perspective for these women to find a home. This phenomenon can be seen in the villager's perspective of Silas when he first arrives. That society is a perfect reflection of the society ruled by myths, by superstition, and by ingenuity that later became faithful. To conclude, it must be said that the novel is an excellent portrait of a society panicked by change. It could be debated whether this crisis of faith was beneficial or not, but it cannot be ignored the impression that it left on humanity. Not only were the characters based on actual occurrences to regular people at the time, but we can see traces of this crisis until right now. Globally, people were not the same after having been stripped of everything they thought they knew for a long time. Arguably, the younger generations are having this sort of awakening as of today. We can see this in the decreasing attendance and participation in religious activities for young people everywhere. It will be up to the future to decide whether that path must be crossed again or it will change route. Thank you very much.